a starting point is the acceptance that, until we become aware of and learn and understand the history, it's tough to understand, to comprehend the complexity of it. And so, and maybe starting with Indigenous rights. And so we know that rights exist within the Constitution, and rights are held by Indigenous peoples of Canada, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. And they've always been here. They've been here since well before Canada became a country. But for many people, and the government included, they've chosen to ignore them.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Unleashed, the fastest hour on the internet, where every episode we feature a best-selling author or world-renowned thought leader, all in the name of helping you elevate your leadership impact. I'm your host, Jeff Tetz, and I want to thank our season sponsor, PowerEd. PowerEd is an award-winning division of Athabasca University who partners with organizations looking for impactful online learning solutions. Their on-demand online offerings include leadership, project management, artificial intelligence ethics, digital transformation, embracing allyship and inclusion, and digital wellness. Check out the team from Athabasca University at athabascau.ca. In a very special episode of Unleashed, we're joined by Indigenous Relations Advisor Annie Korver. In this episode, she shares very deep personal stories along with steps that we can all take in the path towards reconciliation. Please enjoy. I want to also respectfully acknowledge that we are situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. While we spend our time today on a virtual platform, I would like our listeners to also take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we all call home. I also acknowledge the great respect we have for the histories, the languages, the cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant communities. Now, my very special guest today is Annie Korver. Annie is a purpose-driven entrepreneur dedicated to enriching relationships between Indigenous and corporate communities. Inspired by reconciliation in Canada and her own Métis ancestry, Annie founded Rise Consulting to respond to reconciliation and advance Indigenous inclusion with a focus on economic development. Annie holds a Master's of Business Administration from the University of Calgary. She is a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta, a volunteer director on the board with the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, a board member with the Canadian Business for Social Responsibility, the Weaving Roots Foundation, and is co-chair of the Young Women in Energy, Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation Committee. Annie also serves on the board of directors with the Shared Value Solutions. Annie lives within the homelands of the Ktunaxa peoples in Fernie, British Columbia, with her husband and their two young children, where they enjoy skiing, biking, and hiking as often as possible. Annie, welcome to the program today.
Good morning, Jeff. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. It's really great to be here.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So the introduction may have been kind, but I can't help thinking, where do you find any spare time?
Well, there's not a lot of it right now, but I try to bring balance to my life. I really acknowledge that the mountains are my medicine. And with our recent move to the homelands of the Ktunaxa people, I've had more chance to spend time on the trails because they're right out my door now. We were in Treaty 7 territory in Calgary for just over a decade, and it was always a little bit of a commute. I've got many friends listening today, and they know what the trails like are in Bragg Creek. And although wonderful, it was still a 35-minute drive. And so that time, Jeff, I'm saving that time.
Yeah, and I'm very envious. I hope someday to live in the mountains in my backyard as well. And look, Annie, we can appreciate the demands on your time, especially today on this very special day. I want to just thank you so much for making time here to help educate, help us learn, and hopefully take some action in the direction of reconciliation. And I thought maybe where we could start is just a little bit of how are you feeling today, and what does this day mean for you and your family?
Yeah, it's a great place to start. And I feel really encouraged. I mean, I thank you, Jeff, for the land acknowledgement and starting off in a good way. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships. And that in itself is an act of reconciliation. The time you and I are spending, the time that others are spending with us right now as they listen. And social media, I'm not a big user of social media, but I use LinkedIn, and the messages, the stories, the resources that are available, even the change from when the team that I work with at Rise started to create resources for our clients to what's available now, sort of 4 weeks later since sort of sharing those resources. It's incredible. The momentum it's happening. It's, and Rise is purposeful in supporting the rising presence of Indigenous peoples. And I feel that. I see that right now.
Yeah, and Annie, your reputation precedes itself. I know a number of people and a number of companies, some of our clients included, that have worked with you, and you have an incredible reputation. So you're doing phenomenal work. And it did kind of make me wonder, how did you start doing reconciliation work in the first place?
Thank you. I'm really humbled by that. And I can get emotional about it because I just, Jeff, I'm a vessel for the work. I was in my graduate studies at the U of C. You mentioned that I did my MBA, and that was a decade ago. It's like, don't tell anybody, it's been a decade. But I was working at Calgary Economic Development at the time, and I was learning really for the first time about rights and title in the classroom as we were looking at energy development cases. And I knew that my own genealogy through my dad's mother, who was one of 8 children growing up just north of the Red River settlement in Manitoba, was Métis, but we didn't talk a lot about it. And so after some digging and multiple conversations with my father, his sister, various members of my family, aunties that I didn't know that I had, and then some work with a genealogist with the Métis Nation, I've been able to learn so much more about our roots in the settlement and what life would have been like in the community from the late 1700s through until the early 1900s. And so as I learn, the more I learn, the more I apply. And I think we'll talk more about this framework that I use, listen, learn, reflect, act, later on this morning. But it's really in acknowledging the privileges that I had to grow up in a middle class family in Revelstoke, in understanding those experiences, the stable house that I lived in, both parents having a post-secondary education because they were encouraged and supported to do so, and a result I was. So at the time, 10 years ago, I didn't have the depth of knowledge that I have today, and my ability to now connect my personal circumstance to the circumstances of both non-Indigenous and Indigenous Canadians. I'm driven to participate in building a future for Canada where one group's prosperity doesn't come at the expense of another's rights or well-being. And so Rise was founded in 2013 with that in mind. I was completing my graduate studies. I was looking at a project with Kinder Morgan Canada, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. And today, Rise has grown to be a national management consulting firm advancing reconciliation in Canada. And I'm so honored to have been able to work with you in the past, Jeff, to work with other clients at Results, and to share this space with you today.
Annie, you mentioned education, and I'm really encouraged by the response we even had just for today's conversation. And it tells me that not only do people want to learn, but they want to start taking action and be part of the solution when it comes to reconciliation. So I hope by the end of this conversation, people are going to have a foundation of knowledge, no matter what level of understanding you're coming into this episode with. You're going to leave here with something that you didn't know before. And more importantly, we're going to equip you with some actions that you can take to start moving in the direction of reconciliation. So Annie, a question I have is, so why today? Why September 30th? Why of all the days is this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation?
Mm-hmm. Well, and interesting you say that, because the shirt that I'm wearing today, Jeff, it's actually a few years old, and it So that the orange shirt movement and orange shirt day is a term that we've used actually since 2013. And it was a movement that was created to recognize the colonial legacy of residential schools and to commit to the ongoing process of reconciliation. And Orange Shirt Day recalls the experience of residential school survivor Phyllis Webstad, and you can find her book in bookstores or online. And she attended the St. Joseph's Mission Residential School in 1973, and her orange shirt was taken away from her. And so September 30th was chosen by her because that was around the time of year when Indigenous children were removed from their families and forced into residential schools. And that to me is an emotional aspect just into itself. When I think about my own childhood and going to school or getting Finn ready. I mean, my son is 4 and he goes to preschool on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Today it's closed, which is a good thing, but it's an exciting time, right? It's a time of anticipation and new clothing and new crayons. And that wasn't the case for Indigenous peoples. It wasn't a choice. And in recognizing this, September 30th was chosen because it was around that time of year when Indigenous children were removed from their families and forced into residential schools. And so following this, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this is the book of the calls to action. Call to Action 80, when published in 2015, it was a call to the federal government to establish a statutory holiday, a national day for truth and reconciliation to honor survivors, their families, and their communities, and to ensure public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools. And I can't help but reflect on the first question you asked and sort of what am I seeing, what am I feeling? And I see so much of this, and I see it today, and I see it every day in my work. And so in June of 2021, Bill C-5 was passed, and the statutory holiday was put into place, and call to action number 80 was made to be active. And so we see lots of organization. It's been really interesting to watch the change where some organizations were saying they weren't going to recognize it as a stat, and then they were. Others that aren't able to because, I have clients that, they're doing turnaround work. And so they're on site today, but they're taking moments to pause. They're taking intentional moments to listen and learn. But I mean, I think, Jeff, no doubt we have a long way to go in the process of truth and healing, justice and reconciliation. There remains a lack of understanding, but the opportunity is there. You have influence, Jeff. I have influence. We all, everyone who's listening, we have the opportunity to make change, to participate. And so I think really it's in this time that we have together or later in the day to take time, to take a moment to remember why it is that we're amplifying this awareness. Talk to our friends, talk to our family, our clients, our children, and spend intentional time.
Annie, because I think that I see that quite a bit, that's the advice, is to take the time to think, reflect, to learn, to listen. Are there some places that you want to maybe even just direct people to right now where they can go to find good materials and good resources to be able to have meaningful conversations? I think the conversations I have with a lot of non-Indigenous people is that they want to have these conversations, but they don't necessarily know where to go to find the right resources or how to even start the conversation. So you kind of mentioned that. So it seems like a good segue to maybe share a little bit of insight on what you have to say about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. The work that our team does at Rise is really around weaving reconciliation. And I use this dream catcher analogy in weaving it into everything that we do. And so with that in mind, an opportunity to act exists everywhere. And so although I don't watch a lot of television, I look forward to watching television in my future. The Aboriginal Peoples Television Network. So this evening, as you sit down and chill out, try turning that on. Try taking a look at the episodes. What are Indigenous producers? What are they producing for us to watch? How can we learn through that platform? Podcasts, music. We were listening to Fawn Wood and her music before we got into our conversation. Media sources like the newspapers, Indigenous writers, books. Jeff, I know that you've read this book, 21 Things You Didn't Know About the Indian Act. It's a fantastic, fairly straightforward read by Bob Joseph. In your backyard, the U of A has a massive online open course. It's called a Mooc, and I'm actually doing it for a second time right now with the girls that I sit in circle with in the Young Women of Energy Indigenous Relations Committee. We call it Mooc Club instead of book club. It's fantastic. It's an online course. It's free. You can pay. I think it's maybe a nominal fee. Maybe it's $50 if you'd like the certificate. But the U of A Indigenous Canada course is hands down a fantastic resource, probably the best resource that I've come across. There's a lot of short courses online, that sort of thing. But it's really just, I think the intentional act is actually in the moment. If you're about to listen to some music or you're about to read the news, just stop for a second and think, is there something by an Indigenous artist, author, something like that, Jeff, I think is a good first step.
Great advice. We talked a little bit about the history of September 30th and Orange Shirt Day. And I wonder also a little bit of history about, so the TRC report being completed in 2015. What are some of the historical pieces centered around reconciliation that you think are important for people to gain a better understanding of?
It's complited. We don't have enough time, Jeff.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I guess, I think the reason I asked the question is I hope that we can give people just some tidbits. They're going to pique curiosity and lead them in a really productive direction so that they can continue the exploration on their own. So if there are some highlights or some things that you do want to perhaps just reference, that might be a good use of this time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's complex, but I think a starting point is the acceptance that, until we become aware of and learn and understand the history, it's tough to understand, to comprehend the complexity of it. And so, and maybe starting with Indigenous rights. And so we know that rights exist within the Constitution, and rights are held by Indigenous peoples of Canada, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. And they've always been here. They've been here since well before Canada became a country. But for many people, and the government included, they've chosen to ignore them or actively try to extinguish them. And we've seen this in quotes. Duncan Campbell Scott in 1910 had said that they'd like to find a solution for the Indian problem. And so if we back up to what's called the Doctrine of Discovery, this was really in the late 1400s. Pope Alexander VI was issuing papal bulls. So he was serving between 1492 and 1503. And in this time, really they were going out to conquer the new world. And they were looking, this process of conquest, of colonization. And the term terra nullius is one that you might know, Jeff. It's really a term that was developed in the 1500s, and it means that they were looking for land that was legally deemed to be unoccupied or uninhabited. But of course, for Turtle Island, or what we call Canada today, that wasn't the case. Millions of Indigenous peoples were living here prior to the arrival of Europeans. And so the Doctrine of Discovery, this concept that gave title to the lands found or claimed, it was really this process where Europeans were coming to Turtle Island, and because Indigenous peoples were not Christian, they were not considered human, and therefore this enabled the disposition of lands starting in the late 1500s. And so as Europeans started to come and as the land started to be settled, we started to see historic treaties and then early treaties. You mentioned Treaty 6. I'm in unceded territory here living in Fernie, British Columbia. But the treaties were being formed. And that was really an important part of, I guess, our history and our process. An important sort of document was the 1763 Royal Proclamation, which was issued by King George III, which was really prohibiting settlers from encroaching on First Nation territories. There were these wars, there was disease, it was just chaos. And so the Royal Proclamation provided that treaties were to be negotiated and signed prior to lands being taken up by settlers. And so we carry on in the process, and there's lots of information about treaties. And something listeners can do is you can spend some time on the Google later learning about the aspects of the treaty if you're living in treaty territory. But there's over 630 First Nation communities in Canada and 3,100 reserves. And reserve land was part of, it was a formula that was part of the treaty making process. Another important component was the Constitution Act in 1867. And following that, the first residential schools opened in 1870, and the Indian Act, the book that we were chatting about, it really mandated this this process with residential schools. And really, that it was sort of in the Indian Act that all Indian matters were starting to be governed. And so, under the Act, it was mandated that all Indigenous children would attend residential school. And this sort of gets us up to why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed in 2008 and the completion in 2015. But I mean, it's really heartbreaking, and I get emotional when I think about what was happening at that time, because Sir John A. Macdonald in his address to the House of Commons, he said, when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents. And he called them savages, and he is surrounded by savages. And he may learn to read and write, but his habits and training and mode and thought are that of an Indian. And so he said, it has been strongly pressed on myself as the head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn. And so Jeff, parents who didn't send their children voluntarily had their children forcibly removed by Indian agents of the government. And this is in excess of 250,000 children. A friend of mine, Holly Forte, has a really beautiful video on YouTube called A Mother's Voice. And it's the story of her mother and her sisters being taken from their community in the Wood Buffalo area. And so there were approximately 130 schools in Canada, and the last in Saskatchewan just closed in 1996. And so when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission started, it was sort of started in 2008. It was really with that in mind. It was sort of on the heels of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which was the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history. And so the commission was formed as a means of reckoning with the devastating legacy, the forced assimilation, the abuse left by the residential school system. And so through the years that the commission was going on, led by the Honorable Murray Sinclair, they heard from thousands of residential school survivors. And once they completed these interviews, what came out of it was a final report and the 94 calls to action. And so as they documented information and as they heard the stories, really Indigenous peoples and sort of the calls to action came to be the call of response, the opportunity to participate. And I think, the history and reconciliation, Jeff, the word, it really, for me, it means relationship. It means the opportunity for us to move forward and acknowledge the interests, the needs of each other. It's about truth and it's about justice. And we have that opportunity to ask ourselves, what kind of relationships do we want? And for Canada to prosper, we must establish a new relationship. And we all have a role to play, Jeff. And so, although that's not a lot, that felt like a lot, you can see how the history knits together how we are where we are today, that today is the 30th. It is National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Call to Action 80 was part of the calls that came through that process.
Annie, I just want to take a second to acknowledge the level of vulnerability that you're bringing to this conversation. And I think it goes without saying that anybody that's listening right now is reaching out to you and sort of putting their arms around you, because I think we can all feel that. in a way that we'll never understand, but we can certainly start to gain a way deeper understanding and appreciation for how just the atrocities, and just how atrocious this was. And as you start to tell some of these stories, I mean, even having the orange shirt taken from you, we can all identify with what it was like to be a child going to school, especially in our younger formative years, and how your back to school outfit was the thing. And then you start to talk about just the unimaginable of being ripped out of the arms of your parents, and not only leaving your parents, but your parents having to see their children. And it's hard to imagine that this actually happened in Canada. It really is. And you corrected me when we had a conversation a few weeks ago. You corrected me because I was asking questions about the history and the sort of how we got here. You were very clear to remind me that this is actually not history. This is current. This is ongoing. And I wondered if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. And I think when there was 215 bodies found in Kamloops, there was really this awakening, this awareness, and for I guess friends of mine, colleagues, women that I sit in circle with, what became very difficult at that time, Jeff, and because for a lot of us that have a history, that are closer to it, that have maybe had family members that have gone through residential school systems, or the residential school system, is that there was this focus that the language was past tense, this dark history. But the reality is that the history and the system and the act has led to and created injustice, the intergenerational trauma that exists, the ongoing barriers that are in place for Indigenous peoples. They exist today. And that's why I corrected you, Jeff. That's why it's important to say that it's a dark history and it's an ongoing issue. It's a challenge. It's an opportunity to respond to. And so the more we understand what those barriers are, the more we can do to participate and to support the rising presence of Indigenous peoples, or to support equality, to support justice.
Annie, I'd like to talk a little bit about terminology. And another thing that you spoke to me a little bit about in our lead up to this was why the term BIPOC doesn't work. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. It's not that it doesn't necessarily work. It's not a term that I use, Jeff. And Black, Indigenous, and people of color, all of these individuals, face systemic racism. And I have a good friend, Erin Davis, who has taught me a lot about this. And as an Indigenous woman, I recognize and I understand Indigenous rights and title and the reality of nation to nation. I talked about treaty and treaty making. I didn't get into sort of the background on the nation to nation relationship, but it's important to be aware of and to note that our nations existed before Canada as a nation was formed, and rights are unique. They're unique in Canada. And so Indigenous peoples, as we exercise rights that are constitutionally protected, that would be what I would say would be a difference in sort of why I wouldn't use the BIPOC acronym to sort of clump everyone sort of together into the same group.
What about terminology, Annie? Like, how do we know, and how does a person know when to maybe refer to First Nation versus Indigenous versus Inuit, Métis, Aboriginal? And we had some conversation about that, and I wouldn't mind maybe a little more elaboration, because I think a lot of people have similar questions.
Yeah, it's a good question. I get it a lot. And I learn actually all the time. I was speaking at an event with my good friend Alicia Dubois a few weeks ago, and she took this one, she answered it. I was like, oh, that's neat. I like your perspective. And we learn all the time. But I mean, a good sort of rule to start with is always just ask, right? Ask somebody you're with, politely, kindly, how they like to identify, and ask about sort of the history of the community. Again, that is an act of reconciliation. But the term Indigenous peoples, and it a little bit goes back to the last question that you asked, is that the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, so sort of globally, defines Indigenous peoples as descendants of the early populations living in the area. And so although we see the term Aboriginal used a lot, and it's used in our Constitution, it's used in a lot of languages, and we're sort of starting to see the switch. And the reason for that is that, the root meaning of ab means away from or not original in Latin. And so that's not well received by Indigenous peoples. And so this shift is happening, and we start to hear Indigenous used more. And so Indigenous peoples of Canada in the Constitution recognized as First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. And so for First Nation, often the term Indian has been used in the past, and it's no longer used. It can be seen as a derogatory word, Jeff. I do have friends. I have a good friend on Vancouver Island, and she refers to herself as an Indian. She asks that she is called an Indian. She has an Indian status card that she pulls out of her wallet, and so she's good with it, and that's her choice. But we use First Nation more often. And for myself as a Métis woman, it's a person who self-identifies as Métis, as distinct from sort of the two other Indigenous peoples in Canada. And we really we're registered through nations, but not in the same sort of registry process of people who are status or non-status Indian. And we're the descendants of the union between First Nations women and European men during the fur trade. And then the third group is Inuit. And you may have heard the word Eskimo. It's a term also that is now seen as a derogatory term in most cases. But again, if that's a term that they use, that they like, that's okay. But Inuit is the term that's most widely used for an individual person, and Inuk. So I have a good friend, Andrea, and Inuk, and so that's a good word to use.
Yeah, I read a really great book about a year and a half ago, and it was basically two college women that traveled to every U.S. state and talking about how racism impacted people in those regions. And one of the first places they went to was Alaska. And when they talked to elders in Alaska, they talked about the origin of the word Eskimo sort of being a derogatory term that Russian settlers had sort of bestowed upon them. And as soon as I read that, I thought, wow, geez, that's enough for me to know that Eskimo is a derogatory term we should no longer use. And I know we've changed the name of the local football club to the Elks. And I think that's a great choice, a great decision. And it's about time that they did that. What about land acknowledgements, Annie? Why are land acknowledgements so important?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. And I'm grateful that you started with a land acknowledgement today. Is there's three big things in a land acknowledgement, Jeff, is one, the opportunity to understand how has the land been used, who has or is using the land, and just that awareness, acknowledging the beauty and the uniqueness of where you are. Second, when I share a land acknowledgement, I usually share something about the why. So why is it important for me? What's the connection for me? And when I opened today with sort of my story and really starting to understand my own lineage and my heritage, our stories connect us. So what's unique for you in this land? And although often, especially in this virtual world, we're not leaving our territory, you might sort of say the same land acknowledgement. I always challenge myself. I'm a newcomer to the homelands of the Ktunaxa people here in Fernie. And so I'm learning about how the land was used. I was being taught the other day about the myth of the ghost rider and what does that mean? Who is that? What happened? And then the third piece of the land acknowledgement is the what's next, the why. Can you turn it into an action? Can you state something that's actionable as you share a land acknowledgement? And part of that, and I love this part, is that being an act of reconciliation, those that are listening to you, they're learning in that moment. So when we think about the importance of listening and learning and our ability to build our knowledge. It's so complex. And so what little things can we do is, Jeff, every time you share one, depending on where you are, it's then an opportunity for you to share a bit of knowledge with everyone that you're speaking to.
Yeah. Annie, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the calls to action there, we don't have time to go through in great detail what the calls to action are, but I am interested in your perspective as to whether or not you think enough progress is being made. And sometimes progress can seem slow at the start, and then you reach a tipping point and progress seems fast. But I'm really interested in your perspective in terms of how much progress we're making. Is it fast enough? Should they be doing more?
Progress is, well, I guess it's a measure that we all have individually, Jeff, and it's really sort of through the lens of the person experiencing it, who's viewing it, who's assessing it. For me, substantial progress has been made. I am in awe, even in my own time, since RISE was created in 2013. The change that has happened, and when in 2013, I was working for quite a few years with the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, and we were being regulated by the National Energy Board at that time. The change to the Canadian Energy Regulator, the creation of the Indigenous Advisory Committee, the contractor standards that we were creating at that time in educating the major pipeline construction companies that would be working on the project, the subs that would be supporting those major primes. It's phenomenal to see the difference and those indicators, those measures of impact. Reconciliation, I might get emotional again. It's not an endpoint, Jeff. It's this ability to look around. And for me, I have a friend who just finished in a very senior role in a company that has exploded under his leadership. And I was so proud of him because in his closing letter, he talked about that impact, the jobs created, the change to wellness, health and wellness of the people of that community. And that's reconciliation. That's progress. When we can look around, Jeff, and see equality in the Indigenous peoples at various levels through our organizations, if we can look on our board and see and listen to an Indigenous voice, this is progress. And so I am so grateful for everyone who's listening and for the work that's happening today. And could we do being more? Yeah, I'm sure we could, but am I so proud of the work that's being done that we have our orange shirts, that I'm not sure how many people are listening. Absolutely. I mean, social media, have you seen LinkedIn over the last month? It's amazing. The resources that are being shared, the stories that are being shared, the vulnerability. Did that answer your question? Yeah,
well, it does. It does. And like all of the questions I'm asking you, I mean, we could probably dedicate an entire day and more to each of these topics. Annie, I would love for you to talk a bit more about RISE, your company, and the basis and the purpose that you founded it on. And I know that you have put a lot of effort along with your team to create a bit of a framework to actually help people and help organizations create meaningful alliances and partnerships with Indigenous communities. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, and it's been a journey, and it's neat to get to know you, Jeff, a little bit, and just as an entrepreneur, it can be really lonely sometimes as you're trying to figure it out. It's like I did an MBA, but I'd never been an entrepreneur. I hadn't started my own business. I hadn't sort of created sort of structure and framework. And I'm so grateful for all the mentors that have been teaching me as I listen and learn. And the framework that we use at RISE, or I guess sort of some of the pieces that are important to us is really beginning with the end in mind, and knowing that it's a journey and that it's going to take time, and that we work together to do that. And at RISE, we focus on the creation of shared value in all aspects of a business, so in the various business units. And so we work with organizations to understand the values they hold, what makes them unique, and then how to weave those values into a reconciliation pathway, an Indigenous inclusion strategy, and then a work plan, which are the tactical pieces. And so a few minutes ago, when I mentioned my friend, what ends up becoming sort of the outcome or the output are actually metrics, and the opportunity to say we move the needle through the creation of an Indigenous mentorship program. We now have more Indigenous employees through the creation of a supply chain diversification program. We now are making purchases from Indigenous businesses, and that supports the rising presence of Indigenous peoples, and that supports the vision of a future where one's rights and well-being do not come at the expense of someone else's. And so as we create those sort of frameworks, we really focus on listen, learn, reflect, act. And so there's this emphasis, half of the equation is on listening and learning. The more that we can, I'm talking a lot, the more that we can be quiet. Creator gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, and listen and then reflect on what we've heard, the more we can then act and really focus on making decisions and moving forward in partnership. And RISE works with the tenet, nothing about you without you. Or for me as an Indigenous woman, nothing about me without me, which is really the antithesis of the Indian Act, the antithesis of assimilation. As we build together, don't assume, ask.
Yeah. Annie, you're the guest of honor, so you shouldn't be doing any listening on this call at all. Nobody shows up to listen to me, that's for sure. Could you share some examples, I wonder? So when you talk about, so there's sort of 4 key pieces to your framework around listening, learning, reflecting, and acting. How does listening and learning show up? Like what would be an action or an activity that a company could take to actually demonstrate those 2 points?
And I laugh. True, and so we and Jeff, and we can take that we start by under collective knowledge that we have about that. We can assess knowledge do we have, what do we individually, and then we create a to that, and we work. You can try management process depending on the and then and the ability for somebody this is woven into all aspects. Members of your team who work in community, or let's, maybe you have a comms plan already, Jeff, but let's weave reconciliation into our comms plan. Let's purposely create reconciliation moments, Indigenous inclusion stories. Let's share them within our own team internally so we continue to build our knowledge, and externally with our clients. And it's the same for procurement or for somebody in employment and training. It's the application of your knowledge into the creation of a process or a system, and then the output with KPIs, metrics, and really sort of changing. If you have a balanced scorecard, if you have sort of 8 metrics that you review at your leadership meeting, that you start to see inclusion and reconciliation show up in that.
Annie, what are some major differences between, if this is not the right term, please correct me, but let's say colonial business customs and norms versus Indigenous ones? And because I think all too often, it's one person's way or another, and we don't take time to understand that. But what are some common mistakes that we make when we're trying to create meaningful partnerships within Indigenous communities and First Nations?
I think regardless, and I've got a colleague at RISE, Jillian, who's been really helpful as I'm learning about this area, is that colonial it's everywhere and we don't know it. You don't feel it because it's the system we live in, the way we operate. Colonial ways of being, clocks, agendas, very scripted, whereas I think when you take a moment and just pause, it can be quite shocking that everything is that colonial, or where did I learn that, or why am I acting that way? And when you're building a relationship, which will potentially move into a partnership, a form of a partnership, you have the opportunity to just take pause and ask the other participant, the other party, is this something that works for you? And is this a way that we can be? And when I'm working with organizations, we talk about protocol and communication protocol and asking and sharing tobacco as knowledge is exchanged. Time is a great example. It's not a natural protocol traditionally. Indigenous peoples didn't wear watches. The sun set, the seasons changed. I've been taught by my elders that to wait for someone, that's a sign of respect, because we don't know what that other individual has been doing or why they're late. And this myth that exists around Indian time, it's not because an Indigenous person doesn't care or that they're blowing you off if you're a settler. They probably have had another priority that's not your priority. And so we have the opportunity to just take stock for a minute and just reflect. So what's that person up to today? What did they face this morning as they woke up, or when they went to bed last night? Did they go through their routine? Jeff, I know you wear an eye mask and have earplugs, but not all of us do, right?
Well, you can't tell, that's for sure. Yeah, so those are some interesting insights. And so the thing that really grabbed me there was that waiting for someone is a show of respect. And I think what it highlights is you can't fake a meaningful partnership. So you actually have to genuinely and authentically care about understanding somebody else's perspective and a day in the life of their world. And I know a lot of people that have created some tremendous partnerships with First Nations communities. And I think that that's what they do. They're great people, first and foremost. So they genuinely care about creating win-win relationships with all stakeholders. And you probably find that that's the same in the work that you're doing.
Or that's what I aim to achieve in the work that I'm doing, Jeff, because it's not anyone's fault. It's not like it's sort of planned. Organizations will come to Rise and they'll, I really need a partnership, or I need a joint venture with, XYZ nation. It's like, oh, do they know that you need that? Have you talked to them about that? What are their needs? What are their interests? What are they looking for as they build own source revenue, as they move towards sovereignty, as they support the rising presence of their people? And so that's where there's room for a conversation and to move away from assumptions and to ask lots of questions.
Annie, what do you think are some of the biggest obstacles to progress right now?
Resources in community, the big one, Jeff. I think as organizations are tooling up in this space, we know there's a lot of practitioners working in this area, which is fantastic. Organizing. I see the sign behind you. I'm friends with SurePoint, which is great. They're doing amazing work, and we have individuals working and attempting to work in community, sort of from the corporate side. Say we're good intention. We'd like to understand. We'd like to respond, but it's difficult when a community doesn't have the resources to respond, to sort of come back to the circle, to sit in circle, to share ideas. And so what we can do is we can work as corporate Canada, or, I mentioned my friend Alicia at the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corp. This organization has been created to support a gap, to sort of fill a gap and provide loan guarantees and to provide access to capital, making financing more available, because there isn't somebody in community. In some communities, there absolutely are, but not in every community, that has the ability to participate in a project or to build a relationship, because there isn't somebody in that role. And so that's tricky, and that can be really deflating when as corporate Canada, we're responding to the call. We've got a strategy. We're reaching out. We're looking for a response. And, when it's radio silence on the other end, then we have to sort of look at other options to participate in resource building programs for Indigenous peoples.
You mentioned before, Annie, this work will never be done. And I think everybody agrees with that. The reconciliation will be the work of everyone's lifetimes for generations to come. But is there a point where we'll be able to look around and acknowledge that we've actually crossed the threshold where meaningful progress has been achieved? And if we can reach that kind of a threshold, what would we be seeing? What would the world look like if we could say, okay, legitimate, sustainable progress has been finally achieved?
Yeah, and we chatted a little bit about this with has been achieved, but it's maybe never an end state, but instead this constant act of co-creation. And I had the good fortune of spending some time with Dr. Mike DeGagne, the CEO of Inspire. And Mike said to me that, Annie, what I see through reconciliation, with reconciliation, is a movement from reconciliation to co-creation. And it was interesting because at Rise, I've been using this lingo around creation of shared value, and really from my graduate studies work around Michael Porter's model, the creation of shared value, and the difference with CSV versus corporate social responsibility, or CSR. But it's really, looking around and thinking about your organization and looking at, your organization in the Dreamcatcher lens, and saying, I see Indigenous businesses in our supply chain. I see and am working with Indigenous peoples in all levels of the organization. We're making community investments in all aspects of our work, and Indigenous communities are part of that. I see it in our leadership team with our commitment to building an inclusive culture. I can count on my finger the number of experiences that I've had as related to building my own knowledge about Indigenous peoples and cultures, the history. Those are the items, Jeff. I think that as we move and as we sort of take stock of what we're up to and the experiences that we've had, or the organizations that we're part of, those are the indicators of progress. Those are the movements. Those are the acts of reconciliation.
Annie, is there anything that you were hoping we were going to have a chance to talk about today that we haven't, or is there something that you'd really like to impart on the listeners that you haven't had a chance to say yet? And I want to give you that opportunity right now before we move into 3 and 30.
Well, it's live, Jeff. It's a podcast. I'd love to turn the tables for a moment. I'm really keen to know for you, Jeff. You and I have known each other for just over a year. Share a little bit about your own story. What does this look like for you?
Yeah, well, that is a question I wasn't prepared for. But here's how it feels for me. Is it feels very shameful. So when this has been such an honor to sit and have this conversation with you today, Annie. I feel very shameful, though, because I had no idea that this is the history with which Canada was founded on. And I didn't know much about residential schools until a couple of years ago. And so I think coming to terms with this country that you love and filled with people that you love, and I'm so grateful for the life that you have. And then you look around, and the older you get, the more you realize that so many people have never had a chance to experience what that actually feels like. And so that's a motivator and a driver for me. But I think if you're non-Indigenous, a good mindset will be that you feel like you have never done enough, or you could never do enough to make this right and repay it. Because I think that serves as a good tension point to keep that motivation strong. My biggest fear is what happens after a conversation like this. And so this is awesome. We did this, we planned this, we've done some reading, some books, you look at the TRC report and you read that, but we have to find ways to keep this momentum going. We have to create actions. And I think we don't have to be martyrs personally, but I think that we have to lift where we stand. So we have to be an influencer with the folks that we're closest with. And so I know our company is very committed to this, and we're going to keep making sure that we're pushing things forward, and we're committing to actions that we're going to take towards reconciliation. And I hope through that it'll make it easier for us to have conversations with our clients, and our clients will start to do the same. We learn from our clients as well, so they do that for us. And I think if we can all just commit to ongoing action and learning, that I believe that we can reach a tipping point of meaningful progress. But Annie, it's hard to accept and acknowledge that this is the state of our country, and this is how so many people have experienced it.
Well, you're lucky that we have a good friendship, and I'll help to hold you accountable, Jeff. And I'm really keen to support the team and to make those goals, to set those objectives. What does the ideal future state look like at results, so that in a year, in 5 years, we can look back and we can see progress and feel really good about it.
Thank you for that. So Annie, that brings us to our 3 and 30. We like to end every Unleashed episode with some calls to action. So that's a really great segue. Annie, what's the 3 and 30 this week?
Yes, 3 and 30 this week. It was hard to sort of narrow down my list of 700, but earlier I was mentioning, Aboriginal People's Television Network, the opportunity to diversify your media. Just take stock of how you spend your time. What are you reading? Who are the authors? What are you watching? What are you listening to? There's some great Indigenous podcasts out there. There's great shows on television, Netflix, YouTube. There's great music. We were listening to Fawn Wood. Her music is beautiful. Second, read the calls to action. Get in touch with me if you would like. I have this great little sort of guide if you're keen to better understand how you can read them and then apply them to your own life. And shop Indigenous. I love this one. I was at the annual Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business event last week, and Jen Harper, if you don't know Jen Harper, Google her, but she owns Cheekbone Beauty, and I'm wearing her lipstick. She has fantastic products. And I mean, there's so many great Indigenous suppliers, vendors, products out there, but this is really great. My earrings are made by an Indigenous designer, a gift from my friend. But specific to Cheekbone, I mean, she's just launched in Sephora. I mean, this is incredible. This sort of the growth of her company. And I think finally the bonus, be accountable. Be accountable for your learning, for your actions, and show up, today and every day, and respond to the call to reconciliation.
Annie, thank you for joining us today. This has been such an insightful, uplifting, raw, genuine conversation. I can't thank you enough. And I know everybody listening feels the same way. Now, we are going to make a $500 donation to the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. And I encourage anybody tuning in right now to do the same. We'll make the link to make those donations on our social platforms, easy to find, and we'll make sure we put them in the show notes. And Andy, we'll make sure it's easy for people to find you as well. You're such a wonderful resource. We've worked with you, or a lot of our clients work with you, and anyone that is not should be. So Annie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeff. Hand to heart for the work that you're doing and for making space for this conversation today. Have a great day. Absolutely.
And if I can leave everyone with this, if you're a settler like I am, it isn't easy to admit that your home, your beloved country may not be what you thought or wished it was. It's not easy to confront the fact that much of what we have based our identities on are falsehoods about Canada being home of the strong and free. I think what we've learned is that Canada has been the land of the free, but only for some. But here's the thing. It's okay to hold opposing emotions at the same time. We can hold space for acknowledging the atrocities done toward Indigenous peoples and feel the guilt and shame that comes with that. And we can also be proud of our country and the many things that we love about it and what it stands for. I have lots of questions and I have a lot of learning to do, but there's something I do know. When we near the end of our days, we're more likely to regret the things we didn't do, the risks that we didn't take, and the courageous help that we didn't offer. So let the pride in our country fuel that courage that's going to be necessary to move us towards reconciliation. And if we can do that, I know we can make this right. Thank you everybody for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and subscribe to our YouTube channel or wherever your favorite podcasts are found. And if you're part of a leadership team and you know that your organization is capable of even better performance, please reach out to us at unleashresults.com for a conversation and learn more about how we might help unleash the potential of your team and organization.